At this time, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Melanne Verveer, Executive Director of the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. Ambassador Verveer is the Executive Director of the Institute. She served as the first U.S. Ambassador for Global Women's Issues, a position that she was nominated by President Obama in 2009. She coordinated foreign policy issues and activities relating to the political, economic, and social advancement of women, traveling to nearly 60 countries. She worked to ensure that women's participation and rights are fully integrated into the U.S. foreign policy, and she played a leadership role in the administration's development of the U.S. National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security. Ambassador Verveer's bio is in your program, and so I'm not going to stand here and read it to you, but she has been the recipient of numerous awards. And at this time, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Verveer to the podium.
Well, hello, everybody, and thank you, Beverly, for your gracious introduction and your leadership of this extraordinary organization. I want to congratulate Together Women Rise on your 20th anniversary. That is a wonderful milestone, and you have been doing good works, making a difference for women and girls all around the world, and that is saying a lot. You know, I co-authored a book, which I think is out here. I don't know if you're doing an auction, but I know I signed it. And several years ago, I co-authored this book called Fast Forward. And the goal was to inspire others to accelerate progress for women and girls by calling attention to the power that each of us has to be a change maker. And as we wrote, know your power, find your purpose, and connect with others. And I think that's a pretty good description of Together Women Rise. And, you know, I do think that if we want to create a more equal world, it will only happen by unleashing the full potential of women. And that is something you have taken to heart, because you have enabled so many around the globe to break down those barriers that keep them back. Now, I remember as though it were yesterday when I was visited at the State Department by two women who came to tell me about their organization called Dining for Women. And one of those women is here, Meryl Steiner, and she brought in Marcia Wallace, who was the founder. And that conversation told me a great deal about the roots of this organization and what you're still doing today. And the more I heard, the more excited I became, because there's nothing like grassroots commitment to bring about real change. And to hear how women from across the country and now from other places in the world were coming together then over dinner, creating community to improve the lives of women and girls around the world. And I thought it was just such a noble undertaking and such a necessary undertaking in our world. And that was over a decade ago. And today, Together Women Rise has grown exponentially, and you have had a transformative impact on helping those who have been living on the outskirts of opportunity to fulfill their potential. You know, it's really an honor for me to be reconnected with you on this special anniversary, particularly, but sadly, at a time when the world is grappling with the highest rates of conflict since World War II, and a time when authoritarian leaders in too many places are on the rise and pushing back on women's progress. And so it's a time, I think, when we have to redouble our efforts. 25 years ago, a little over 25 years ago, I accompanied Hillary Clinton to the 4th UN World Conference on Women. It took place in Beijing, and it was there that the First Lady of the United States proclaimed, "Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights." And you would think that that would be a no-brainer. Women are human, women's rights are human rights. But women's rights weren't even chiseled into international human rights law then. And in her historic speech, Hillary went through a litany of abuses that women confront around the world, from domestic violence to rape as a tool of war, from human trafficking to honor killings, from women denied the right to plan their own families to dowry burnings. And after each of these and more, she said, "This is a violation of human rights. And it is time for all the world to hear that it is no longer acceptable to hold women's rights as separate from human rights." And by consensus, 189 countries, this would not happen today, which is why there hasn't been another conference of this kind. 189 countries adopted a platform for action. And that platform focused on 12 critical areas, including women's rights to education, to healthcare, to participate fully in the economies and political life of their societies, to be free from violence and discrimination. And it's a blueprint all of these years later against which we still measure ourselves. Because although we have made important gains, there is still so much more to do. And women have been instrumental to the progress that has occurred, just as you have enabled much of that progress. And they are still on the front lines advancing it. But regrettably, as we all know, women's equality is still a challenge here at home and around the world. The World Economic Forum, which is a gathering of some of the top business barons around the world, as well as government leaders, annually produces a gender gap report. And you might ask, why do they produce a gender gap report? They're hardly a women's organization by any definition. And they do it because in countries where the gap between men and women is closer to being closed, closer to equality, closer to parity, and nowhere is it completely closed, those countries are far more successful and prosperous. And that World Economic Forum measures the gap between men and women in over 170 countries on 4 metrics: education, health, economic participation, and political participation. And they have noted that at the current rate that we're making progress, it will take over 100 more years to reach parity. This is why we have to accelerate what we do. At the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, where I am, we look at the role of women in peace and security, which is absolutely critical to addressing some of the kinds of challenges our world is confronting. Women need to be at the peace tables. They need to be active in relief and recovery. They need to take their place, and especially that hard work by the first responders, women on the ground around the world, facilitating dialogue, trying to ameliorate conflicts, doing that hard work, and yet they are hardly recognized for what they do and the need to have them at the table. And we annually or biannually publish an index on women, peace, and security. It's the first index of its kind. And it looks at 3 dimensions of women's well-being. Most indices just look at one dimension. inclusion. It's a very important dimension because it covers political participation, access to education, and issues of economic participation as well. But we also add the dimension of justice. Is she discriminated against? How hard is it? What kind of barriers are in her place? And security. Are they secure in their homes, in their communities? And if a girl has a right to an education, that's terrific. We all want to see that. But if she's not safe in her home or even going to school or in school because of the abuse, there's obviously, she is not completely where she needs to be in terms of her well-being. We rank 177 countries, and we just released it last week, the current edition last week, and you can find it on our website. We released it at the United Nations. And the countries where women are oppressed, lack opportunity, or worse, they are mired, you guessed it, in instability, in conflict, in fragility. And the bottom 20 countries of the 177 are involved in conflict as we are all gathered here. So the most dangerous places for women also are the most dangerous places for international peace and security, which is why we do this index. Pay attention to the women, invest in the women, look at what they are doing on the ground. And the real interesting outcome of this, I think, is that, just think about it, the well-being of nations and the well-being of women goes hand in hand. You cannot discount the well-being of women if you want to prosper as a nation. So women's equality is a prerequisite for democracy. In fact, the status of women is also the status of democracy. And there's a correlation. The index shows that where violence against women, domestic violence, other gender-based violence, is pervasive, it correlates to real serious problems in a country. So it seems obvious that when the talents and participation of half the population of the world are marginalized, progress and prosperity will have their own glass ceiling. This is clearly the right thing to do, the moral thing to do. But it is also the smart thing to do. And it is not a zero-sum game. As Gary told you, I'm sure, because he has done so much good work demonstrating how gender equality, women's equality benefits men, that men and women are co-beneficiaries when we make progress together. Everyone benefits, boys and girls, men and women. And this is our task. It's not just a women's issue. It's an issue for all of us. And yet, as we well know, our agenda is far from finished. For example, since Beijing, more and more countries have passed laws criminalizing violence against women. There were no laws prior because it wasn't viewed as a human rights violation. But those laws have not effectively done what they were meant to do because many times they're not funded, they're not implemented, they're not enforced. And yet violence continues to exact a toll on all societies. And here in the United States, maternal mortality rates continue to rise higher than any other high-income country. And simultaneously, we spend the most on healthcare. And the index that we just put out on women, peace, and security has the United States at 37th of 177 countries. Personally, I think that's inexcusable. And maternal death rates are one of the many issues that in the aggregate take us to that score. COVID has had a disproportionate impact on women in the United States and around the world. It has exposed deep gender inequalities. Some of the consequences of COVID really go to the heart of women's inequality. which is why we saw the consequences we did. Alarming rates in gender-based violence, severe setbacks for women in the workplace. In the United States, women lost more jobs than men for the first time, and some economists called it a she-cession instead of a recession because it took such a toll on women. Working mothers incurred increased pressures because of the lack of childcare, and childcare can no longer be explained as marginal to the economy. For years, it's been discounted because it's a women's issue. Well, it really affects our economy tremendously, and maybe that will finally bring us to a better place on making it more accessible. The United States is the only industrial country in the world that does not provide paid paternal leave. We lack on equal pay and addressing the male-female poverty rates. We clearly need to do a better job. So we have challenges both here at home and globally. And globally, as I said, there is a backlash against women's progress. But women are still on the front lines, continuing to struggle for equality. And this afternoon, I just want to give you some places, some challenges that women confront and how they are carrying on. And much of this comes from our own work at the Institute. In Afghanistan, for example, where the Taliban have issued more than 60 edicts to strip women and girls of their human rights, this is what's happening to them. It is nothing less than gender apartheid. They are barred from attending school beyond 6th grade, and growing fears that those younger girls are being exposed to a madrasa kind of education rather than traditional education. The only place in the world that bans girls from going to school. They are barred from working. Even single heads of household who depend on that work to take care of their families, they cannot work. The new restrictions have been imposed on women who are working for NGOs and the United Nations, for example. There's a humanitarian crisis. They're essential to the distribution of humanitarian relief. They have been viewed as objectionable. They are to stay in their homes, except when accompanied by a male guardian. They are not to use parks. Public parks no longer are a place where women can gather. And they have had to have their dress prescribed as well. So what you wear, what you do, where you go, everything is set by the Taliban. So just imagine being a woman in Afghanistan today, what it must be like, and this especially after making 20 years of progress. And this progress being turned back is, to me, a reminder of how fast women's rights can be pushed back, because the Taliban are determined to erase women from public view, and we must not, by our own advocacy and our own work, keep that from happening. I still remember several years ago when I was in Kabul, I was having a discussion with a group of women, and the first one who spoke said to me, "Stop looking at us as victims and start looking at us as the leaders that we are." And I thought she was so right. Even in the worst of circumstances, what it meant was very clear. And today, these same women are running schools in private homes against the bar, against the ban. They are exposing themselves to tremendous risk by doing that. Younger women in particular are out protesting because they had every possibility of going to school, going to college, having a life, having a plan, dashed completely, and they have been imprisoned and risk worse by protesting. Many are running women's organizations to the extent that they can find the wherewithal to continue to help one another. In Iran, It is women who are courageously leading a revolution. It's called the Women's Revolution. A young Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, died after being held by the brutal morality police for allegedly wearing her hijab improperly. Her death sparked a protest movement across Iran led by young women, quickly joined by students and university communities, and by men and women across Iran. People of all ages, all walks of life, have joined together to end the repressive regime and its dictatorial rule. They too have been willing to risk their lives for a cause bigger than themselves. Many of the protesters have been assaulted, imprisoned, and killed, and the Islamic Republic has made every effort to try to silence these brave women of Iran. Their voices, however, have been and continue to be vital, and they have been for decades leading in this area because we don't know that much about what happens in Iran. We don't see and understand how brave the women have been and how they have been on the front lines of trying to create change under the most difficult circumstances. They had 1 million women at one point several years ago signed a petition for change. That was a very brave act under the conditions in which they live. But today, under the banner of woman, life, and freedom, they are saying these cannot be extinguished, and we will continue to struggle. In Ukraine, the unprovoked, full-scale invasion by Russia rages on. Russia has ignored international humanitarian law and the conduct of war and targeted civilians with airstrikes on everything from hospitals, schools, homes, etc. And this death and destruction that has resulted in their effort to defend themselves, their independence, their freedom, their democracy, has been widespread and systematic. Among the crimes is the pervasive use of rape to terrorize mostly women. Those responsible for ordering and committing such crimes must be held accountable. And NGOs in Ukraine are investigating and documenting these cases, trying to bring assistance to victims who are physically abused and traumatized. In order to bring the perpetrators to justice, much work has to go on in terms of documenting these crimes. And one of the people who's in the leadership of this, Alexandra Matvichuk, got last year's Nobel Peace Prize for the extraordinary work she is doing. She and her sisters across Ukraine are leading as soldiers, as diplomatic advocates. They are among the brave journalists and policymakers and providing desperately needed humanitarian assistance. They are the leaders, and they are leading even in the most difficult of circumstances. And in Sudan, in 2019, the world looked at Sudan with a sense of great possibility for peace and democratic change. After 39 years in power, the oppressive dictator who had unleashed widespread human rights abuses, Omar al-Bashir, was overthrown and wanted by the International Criminal Court. The victory would not have been possible without the courageous opposition of civil society, especially women, who constituted 70% of the civil society effort against him. Their leadership and actions were justifiably referred to as the Women's Revolution in Sudan. Yet, where do we see Sudan today? Engulfed in a civil war between two generals coming out of the past who are competing for power and taking a toll on the people in the form of atrocities with warnings that genocide is happening again in Darfur. There is untold death, destruction, and starvation, and yet the Sudanese women remain committed to making their voices heard and again calling for peace and a better future for their country. And this is a time of escalating war and conflicts, no less in the Middle East, with the terrorist attack and the aftermath. Women peace builders are tirelessly working for the safety, dignity, and rights of Israelis and Palestinians, especially for women and children caught in the terrorist attack and the crossfire of war. Working for the safe return of hostages for humanitarian relief and for the eventual return of peace, hopefully one day to a peace table, once and for all, with women gathered around that table to bring better times to the Jewish and Arab people to live side by side in peace. And so just in places where we are working that I am so mindful of every day, bad things are happening clearly, but it is the power, the purpose that women have that is bringing them together in solidarity to try and overcome the challenges that they confront in the worst of places. You know, it was a little over 175 years ago that a group of women and some very supportive men adopted a declaration of sentiments. It was a kind of very early Beijing platform, if you will, but it was about the United States, and it was called the Women's Equal Rights Platform in America, adopted by the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. One of the brave women who participated was 19 years old. She was a glove maker. Her name was Charlotte Woodward. She worked long hours with no hope of keeping her meager wages. She couldn't own property. She couldn't vote. If she needed a divorce because she found herself in a bad marriage, that was not available either. She wanted a better life, and she decided to go to the first Women's Rights Convention in hopes of securing that better life. She wrote of that day that as she set out, she was terrified that no one else would come. The road was empty at first, but then at a crossroad, as the sun was coming up, she saw women and men in carriages and wagons on foot, gradually forming a long procession on the road to equality. We're all still on that road. Women from across America, women from every continent, together, still on that road. So I want to thank you, all of you who have been so dedicated to making a difference for women and girls. Thank you for caring and leading, for working for change and advancing progress. We need to continue our effort and to push this agenda forward, because to do otherwise would be to hold back one of the most powerful, positive forces for shaping our globe, and that is women's equality and ability to do everything they have every right to do. It has been said, in the rising of the women is the rising of us all. So thank you for all that you do and will continue to do.